I've given presentations at these past conferences, a couple of them. Each of these could have been their own presentation, but I'm going to touch on each of them individually, just to give you some ideas for things that you guys may use in your career. So this is a slide I've used before, but Socrates is probably the first person that developed techniques that is very close to our value engineering practice. He taught by asking a series of questions to stimulate critical thinking. And if I could just grow a beard to that size, maybe I could mimic Socrates. One of the questions I suggested is that what's the primary purpose or function of the facilitation, the work that we do? Is it to generate ideas and solve problems, which we do day in and day out? Or is it to have solutions implemented? And there's a higher potential for things being implemented if you've been able to engage some of the stakeholders, participants in the development of the ideas that get developed. And I do this with community associations, different interest groups, even inclusion of some of the design teams when we do VE studies, to include them in the teams. So I had some slides at the beginning of this because to describe paradigms. And this is why it's good to have other participants in your groups that are outside the realm of what we typically do day in and day out. So paradigms, complete fundamental changes in thinking in society have occurred, and sometimes new perspectives of the world evolve, and you don't even know that they've come. And when they come, you don't even realize that it changed completely the way people saw the world in advance of those changes. There's lots of examples, but I won't go into them. So what is a paradigm? It's people accepting the same rules and expecting that is the way the world runs or should be run. It's really a set of assumptions that give us advantage of being able to validate expectations that whatever you're doing is within the realm of what people accept as normal. It establishes the boundaries that you can do things. It tells you how to behave inside those boundaries in order to be successful. And people learn very quickly that to be successful, you have to develop things and ideas that fit into these boundaries. A paradigm shift is a change to a whole new set of rules, and it happens, and all of a sudden you end up with a new paradigm that you have to work within. This is just an example of one of the projects we're doing, but the paradigm that roundabouts always have left conflict signals. We've ended up looking at a location that's got multiple lanes, one of the busiest locations in North America with 2 and 3 lane roundabouts. And the paradigm is that, in fact, the roundabouts operate actually without having fewer conflicts in the signals. It's a change of perspective for the clients we've been working with. So sometimes researchers, scientists can look at data and have unintentional blindness. They can't even see when they've got data before them that doesn't fit the boundaries of what they expect to be normal. Sometimes they'll change their data that they receive to fit within the boundaries of what should be. And you can have focus groups that don't actually see the edges because they expect things to be the way that they've always been. So examples of paradigm shifters could be a fresh person directly out of training. Albert Einstein is an example. It can be somebody that's completely outside the field, which is a typical perspective. They enter it and they don't understand the old rules of the system that's been going on. And the third one is it can just be someone that really doesn't understand the existing paradigm and its subtleties. And these are the people that can be new perspectives within the groups that you're working with. And it's good to shake up the groups, the expertise, the gray hair experts that you have in a room. And sometimes the perspectives come from different user groups. This is an example from the 1930s, the General Electric basis of our VE practice, but new incoming engineers, the director would ask, do you see the hotspot filament in that light bulb? It's your job to develop a new coating that smooths out the bulb glow. But they didn't realize that everybody knew it couldn't be done, and they let the young engineers go off and ponder the world. 1952, a young engineer returned and said, "Is this what you wanted?" And all of a sudden, it changed the paradigm. So we want to shake things up with new people in our working groups we're facilitating. So I'm going to just talk about value planning as I see it or define it. So the only difference between the V job plan for a value planning exercise and our typical VE study would be to focus on just the initial stages. We're trying to generate ideas. It doesn't worry about getting into the development phase, which can come later. And it's a process that you can use with a 1 or 2 day workshop where you start including other people that are beyond the your project team. It's successful to get bigger groups that maybe can't participate for a long duration, but it's really about getting ideas. So this is my definition, the difference between value planning and value engineering. Value engineering typically does the project right. It's down in the weeds. Typically happens later in the project life where you're down into smaller changes. The value planning is really fun because you're doing it to define the right project, and it allows people to look at big picture things, which again is fun. So testing boundaries of value planning early in the project development, doing the FAST diagram with groups, including diverse members in the team, test abstraction to move to the left of the scope line, where in value engineering we typically are working within the right side of the scope line of the project that's been developed to date. And you've probably seen this type of slide before, but value analysis is different than a typical design review, which you typically have a project and you come up with a project A prime. The value methodology allows you to take the project A, hide it as the only way as the solution, and come out of it with a project A prime or a completely different project B. So I just went back and I grabbed a couple samples. This is a project in Ottawa. It's the main water treatment plant. So coming out of the treatment plant, the project was defined to be going to be 3 84-inch water lines that were coming out of the plant to serve most of Ottawa. I actually grabbed 2 water projects, and that was the basis of the teams taking a look at the project. It's funny, but this project ended up in the FAST diagram trying to define functions that were present. The original project had provided redundancy to the project, adding a 3rd water line. And in the function analysis, the provide redundancy was questioned, and why do you provide redundancy was to provide reliability. And as soon as you ask the client, the team members, what are the ideas to providing reliability, redundancy is only one of the possible solutions. In the end, the project changed from a 3-pipe system to a 2-pipe system, where more money was spent to improve the performance level of both of the pipes, and it's been built. Hard to see, but there's only 2 pipes in that picture, so it's been built. This is another bigger picture project, but again, it was a water project. Usually I have transportation examples, but it's a water project. So this is all of Ottawa, and the diversity of the group, we had international participants. There was an engineer that was invited from London, and this idea came out from the person that was participating that came from London. The project was originally to provide a new water supply from the Ottawa River to the Britannia water treatment plant to go straight. So on this map would have gone up and down, a direct supply to the area that's labeled the 2W2C area. It's Barrhaven in Ottawa. And the group with this one outside person, this had already gone through the master plan, had been about 10 years in development of the project. And he questioned there was going to be a link from Barrhaven area to go to the left to the pressure zone, the 3 double off to the left. That was going to be the supply of water to the areas on the west end of Ottawa. And he questioned the life of the chlorine residual that could be present from going to the plant, going to the south, then going to the west. And he questioned if we had the wrong project. In the end, the whole master plan for the water servicing changed, and it provided a direct connection going from the Britannia plant, going direct west to Canada. And it's been built. I watched it being built for about a decade. One person, back to first principles. This is another sample. This is a value planning workshop. I've done it with political participants. I've done one that had nothing but a group of mayors. This has got, this is a transportation example. What is it? It's a value planning workshop that included 7 different municipalities. So it's got elected officials, staff from 7 municipalities. It has several First Nations in the group, Parks Canada. And again, it's engaging them early. This would be defining what future projects would have been in the entire county. So that's the value plan exercise, or exercises that are more focused. The community cafe events is another facilitation techniques. And sometimes we do projects that we've done value planning with technical participants. And this is one that we engage the community. And this is a typical community cafe. Comes from the World Cafe type of facilitation, and it's breaking people up into small groups and asking them leading questions, just like Socrates or how, when, and a fast diagram, and getting people to agree on approaches, solutions that fit with their areas. And it's another way to generate ideas. So as I said, there might have been same type of sessions with the technical staff, and then this is a completely opposite event that happens with the public, business owners, communities. The setup in this is got jazz music playing in the background. People have tea or coffee, small conversations, one-on-one. So the process, the participants are divided into small groups to allow conversations and dialogue. It usually begins, I have a presentation explaining what the process is going to be, what problem we've been asked to review. At the conclusion of the discussion period, participants are asked to change tables and mix between topics. So each table has a topic. Participants are free to sit at a session. They have even smaller conversations, one-on-one, typically where the coffee is and food. And what we have is a recorder at each of the tables that doesn't so much lead the conversation, but records the discussion and invokes questions to generate the discussion. Again, it's just giving them leading questions. So it's focused on a dialogue between neighbors. We're here to listen to your values and priorities. It's an informal discussion of topics. Encourage people to doodle sketches, build consensus of perspectives, discussion recorded, and often we have the tables report back the consensus among the group that was talking there at each of the tables. This is a community cafe event on one of the First Nations. So everyone in this picture is from First Nations. There's a recorder at the table. Again, they're giving a different perspective than as rights holders to the area of projects. It's amazing if you give everybody the same data and have small group discussions, they make good observations and suggestions for. It's also interesting when you work in groups like this, where at a public meeting, you might have had somebody get on a soapbox and stand and try to dominate the room. In these small groups, if you have a person like that, it's typical. It is the other members around this table that ask him to, to get off that soapbox, and they self-regulate the group. It's a good public consultation tool because you get away from somebody trying to dominate the room. This is a sample doodle from a project that's actually, going to the construction phase, but the final design of the project came from this doodle, and it came from a community cafe event. So this is just a sample of cafe discussion topics. So each of these would be their own table, and they would go to each of them, and the group would rotate amongst each of the categories and topics. And at the end, the recorder would have, consensus of the discussion that happened in each of the groups, and they could actually see the discussions that happened at the groups that preceded them. Now, a recent one in the last year is we did one for the federal government. So there's a project that will be delivered in about 10 years, but it's for the National Defense Operation Intelligence Center. And it's to construct as part of a campus, a facility that will be the nerve center for making big decisions, for immediate action, for major actions by the Canadian government. So this is like wars or pandemics, terrorism. What's happened in the Canadian government is that there's many entities that all have a place, a role for many of these major national events. They're disconnected right now. They're not in the same place. And the project is to actually create a nerve center where there's participants from every one of those organizations. And you can see on the right, this is the groups that would all be involved. Some of them are operations, some of them are intelligence, have issues with typically not sharing intelligence to some of these groups, but this would be one area that decisions can be made, being able to see everything that's ongoing for information. One of the issues that they had is so many groups trying to make decisions of next steps for the scope, the size of what this facility would look like. And they'd struggled. And one of the things that we suggested was a cafe event that would include stakeholders from each of the groups. And this was so unusual, but the participants included people to the senior levels of the Canadian military. So this is 1- and 2-star generals, commodores, which is the equivalency of those roles in the Navy. And again, they were put to different tables, topics, and went through a rotation between each of the tables, and allowed open discussion in an organization that doesn't typically allow that, where information typically goes only upwards, and people at lower levels never actually get to sit one-on-one with very senior people in the military. The military is a distinct organization all to itself. So in the end, the exercise to build consensus for what the scope of the project would be moving forward. Talked about very small issues and very big issues. It finally resulted in key decisions about the size and format of the NDOC from the floor of the meeting. And then what was unique about this one is that at the final session, after all the groups were done at their tables and reporting back to the bigger group, there was a final upstairs closed session of the senior leaders, top defense participants who made decisions. So it was more military style. We've heard for the broad consensus of the groups upstairs to agree with what the groups came back with and made decisions. And that allowed the project to move forward. And it was a way to, engage the key decision makers, so the generals, for a $1 billion project. So it was interesting. So instead of this neighborhood cafe, it was senior leaders of the Canadian Defence. Now, this isn't our project. The project hasn't been built yet, but it kind of gives you a sense of the floor. So there will be 1,000 people on the floor. Outside this floor, there'll be other entities that'll be in the big campus, but the main area will be connected in a room that's got 1,000 people, including our NATO partners. And in the center of the nerve central, there'll be a group that will be making decisions as information comes in from operations and intelligence centers. Very interesting. This is an example project that's going on right now, but on Lake Erie, there's a shoreline retreat, and it's, as you see in the top right picture, the lake is got a bluff. It's about 18 meters high. The wave action off the Lake Erie is hitting the shoreline. It's eroding, and it's it's been going on since the last ice age, but it's removing material, depositing back in the lake, and there's sediment transport going along the lake. There's one section of this is former Highway 3. This is in Chatham, Kent, so it's just east of Windsor. And the project was to find a solution for the abandoned road. The road's been closed, so it's in peril. The project had started with the small cracks in the road. By the time this project has got to the stage, there's cracks that are big enough for human bodies to stand in it. It's imminent that the road is going to completely go into the lake. This is from last fall. It's a picture, but I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen, but you can see these are lines along the top of the bluff where the crack of the new limit of the retreat is happening. So there's about $1 billion of houses along this section of the shoreline too. And it's a perilous situation where people don't really recognize what's happening because it's happening in small stages. But the road is in peril first, but there's another whole section of houses along this. And there's houses that are continuing to be built along here. Last year, there was 5 new houses all built at the top of this bluff. So again, a community cafe event at the very beginning. The project began that it was going to be a solution for one small segment where the road was in peril of being lost. And just the public at large invited to participate, to talk about the solution. And the end result of the cafe event was that it had the wrong project and suggested back to council that it come up with a plan for the entire 30-kilometer length of Lake Erie that has the same situation. And then council agreed to, in fact, change the scope of the project. But again, jazz music playing in the background, recorded at the table, listening to people. They would have had different topics, chance to talk or draw. And there was one very vocal member of the public that had come to the meeting. So this has got like 75 people. The great thing about it, the one more hostile person that was closer to the area of media concern, was self-directed by participants at each of the tables. So they kind of direct them to behave at their table. And that's kind of the final outcome of the workshop. So he was looking at the green area off to the left. And in the end, the project ended up looking for a 30-kilometer stretch along Lake Erie with the same issues and concerns with the shoreline retreat. So the third topic, this is all about trying to include participation for decision making. It's something that we do. It is bigger than the workshop event, but it can begin there. And it can end up with workshops that are solely related to comparing alternatives and evaluating alternatives. So it's multi-criteria decision making. In Ontario, some of our projects, we call it MATS, multi-attribute trade-off system. And it's just a way to quantitatively evaluate alternatives. And in Ontario, it is an accepted practice that there's traceability for evaluating alternatives and for public works. So it's one of MECP's 5 guiding principles that there be traceability in the evaluation process. It may not exist in some of the other provinces, but this is something that we do, and it provides great traceability for making big decisions. So this is a process that's been done for really big projects. One of ours has ended up going to the Supreme Court. It's been used not by us, but by others for citing nuclear power plants. But what it does is it's a way that you can traceably show the performance of alternatives and choose amongst them. It's based on the weighted additive method, and it allows a lot of things, but it does allow you to rank very competing alternatives. So the process is based on the weighted additive method. It allows you to address complexity of data amongst alternatives. It's typically used where we have a large number of alternatives or trade-offs among alternatives. It's hard to choose between. It's very traceable. You can see why one alternative performs better than the other. Defensible, especially when there's impacts from even the best of the alternatives. In the end, it'll allow you to answer some what-if questions if you change alternatives to make it better, and allow sensitivity testing based on the perspectives of different people that were part of the evaluation group. So the process, develop a long list of potential evaluation criteria, performance factors, or alternatives that have evaluation criteria. Workshops or focus group meetings to prepare the short list of criteria, performance factors, and variations of the alternatives. Collection of data, environmental inventories to actually compare the alternatives. Creation of social utility functions to define the performance of the alternatives. I'll give one example of this. And then there's a workshop where you do the weighting of the evaluation criteria. That allows you to rate the alternatives, and then you can select the top ranking one, and you can then do sensitivity testing. So what we do is we try to break this into factor groups. So all the criteria would be put into different groups. Depends on the project that you're doing to compare. But in every one of these factor groups, we end up with evaluation criteria or sub-factors to define the benefits or impacts of the alternatives. And these sub-factors are defined by subject area experts. And then you ask a broad group of technical experts or the public at large to weight the importance of competing criteria. So the utility functions are mathematical relationships, again, set by a subject area expert that can defend what they are. So they can be linear relationships, step functions, or they can have different variations, but in the end, they end up giving dimensional scores of utility between 0 and 1 for an alternative. And then 1 represents the best performance of any of the alternatives in the group. A 0 is the worst performance of anyone in the group. And it changes the measurements from things like square meters of wetland removed, traffic operations, number of conflicts, into measurement of utility between 0 and 1. So why do you actually change the measurements from the base criteria? Dollars, wetlands, noise levels. It's because the effects of each of those are mathematically the same units, and you can't combine decibels and dollars. You need to compare apples to apples. And this is a mathematical way that you can change them into a dimensionless measure of utility. And once you've changed it into a measure of utility, you can add utility of one criteria to another, and then you can end up with a score for each of the alternatives. And in the end, the combination of the performance or the effects of any of the alternatives are mathematically correct. So I just threw one in here. So this is an example of the utility function. So this has got steps. They're typically, more often than not, a linear. And even the linear utility functions can be part of a exponential curve, and we're only looking at small slices of the curve. But what it does is it will define the range is only between the best performing alternative and the worst performing alternative. And the anchoring of the comparison of criteria, again, it has to be based on the range of effects between the alternatives you're comparing. And then the weights of importance is only a perspective of the importance of the range of measured effects among the alternatives that you're looking at. So in other comparisons, many people pick their criteria and they have a range from the best to the worst, or a 0 to something. And then their alternatives may only be a small sub portion of that range. But this exercise does is it forces the range to go from the best performing in the group to the worst. And then the weight can be considered back to the real world measurements. So if it may have utility scores that go from 0 to 1, but they reflect the loss of wetland. That's maybe the delta between the worst and the best might be 10 square meters of wetland, 150 square meters of wetland. The dollar delta is always 0 to 1, but the delta in real numbers might only be, $1 million, or it could be $200 million. And then people are asked to give how important is that range of effects. And this is just the sample. Typically, there's a book. All the people at the evaluation and weighting exercise or workshop are giving a book. They get to see the utility range. They're given a definition of what they're actually comparing. And then utility scores at the bottom actually show the range of effects. So this is one criteria looking at the loss of green space. So you might have participants that are from the community association in the room that are giving weights, a broad band of the public. They can all do a weighting exercise, but the performance is usually measured by subject area experts. So when the group gets into the weighting exercise to compare alternatives, everybody's allowed to assign their own weights to the importance of the global factor or the sub-factors. And these are the questions I ask them. So let them appreciate the variation of the measured effects and ask if it's meaningful. If it's a very small delta, it may end up that people give it a 0 weight because it isn't a meaningful difference. Is it an impact that can be mitigated? Typically things that can be mitigated, we get lower weight than things that can't be mitigated. Is it a localized or global factor? Is it something that affects like a single person, or is it something that affects 10,000 people a day? Will the effects short-term or long-term? Things that are very short-term effect are usually given lower weight. And then what are the views of the public? And then this would be the evaluation group that's asked to give weights, dividing them up, all the criteria that have been carried forward that are considered to have meaningful measurable differences amongst the alternatives. And then it's the mathematical scores are divided by the points available, and each alternative gets an exact score. And this little table at the bottom just shows there might have been 50 different criteria. This shows 2 of the criteria, and the points are available after the weighting exercise was done. So out of 100 points, the group decided design consistency was worth 3.25 points. commercial property that was going to be required was worth 1.15. This is how one particular alternative performed. So it had a yes or it got a 1 utility score under design consistency, so it was very consistent. It got a score of 3.25 from that criteria, but it was the worst performing for taking commercial property, so it had a utility score of 0, and then it got 0 points under commercial property required. And it's a way for very complex decisions that you can actually rank alternatives. This is an example. You can see on the top the pie chart. So there was, each of those was a factor group, and then below it there was individual criteria. The public stakeholders would have been part of defining which of the criteria. And there's actually family of solutions. So they range. Each of those lines on the bar chart below were all different alternatives. And in the end, the alternatives, there was the 3 on the left were a family of alternatives, and the one had a variation that was a little bit better than the other 2. And that was a recommended alternative carried forward. And again, this project began with a community cafe event and ended with a weighting exercise to choose alternatives. And it was dominated by criteria that were cultural heritage perspectives. So there's trade-offs for, this is a 100-year-old heritage bridge replacement. In the end, it didn't replace it, it twinned it and maintained the existing heritage bridge. So one of the things you can do with this is you can do sensitivity tests on the weights. So imagine you've had workshops for value planning, you have community cafes, and you've got down to alternatives, and you've got to make very difficult decisions. The weights are all based on professional judgment of the people who are in that evaluation meeting or workshop. And there can be a range of weights between the people that are in the room. Oftentimes when you're seeing this shown to the public, again, you only see the average of the group. This is something what we do where we actually don't lose the base information, and we collect the spread of the weights that were selected amongst the group. And then you can do sensitivity testing and answer what if questions if one perspective had been taken over the average. So in the end, it allows you to test how robust the solution is. So this is just an example. So this was a live project. This is a big project, but the group of evaluators are each a little one of these orange bars. And this was asking the question of all the transportation criteria, how important is transportation over all the other factor groups? And you can see we've got a big range within the group. Some people had the 35 or 40% of the weight. We had a couple of people, or we had 4 people at 50, and we had groups as high as 75. So if you take the average of that, it would have been a bell curve someplace around 50. But the data, so we had people in the group that had looked at importance being 75 or 35. And the interesting thing is you can now stand back and show results going by the average of the groups, or then testing and showing what you would have selected as a preferred one if you had taken the lowest or highest range of anybody in the group. And it's really good if it's consistently the same alternative. So this is a live project. I just brought one. This is getting back to including, stakeholders to be part of the decision-making process. So this is one that's in Kitchener-Waterloo. This is a project that had a value planning workshop. It's a project that has been part of a major corridor expansion with roundabouts. The busiest part of the corridor has been built. It had an EA that was done maybe 10 years ago, and there was difficulty implementing the recommendations because it's an area that has really high traffic volumes, and it has really high pedestrian volumes. There's a major school that's located in close proximity. That's one of the 2 intersections. The number of vehicles that enter the intersection a day is like 50,000. It's the busiest location in the region, and it's coincided with the location of a huge number of pedestrian crossings. and they couldn't find a solution. And the original solution was 3-lane roundabouts. Political pressure, they couldn't implement it. So the project now has included looking at ground root participation in the problem definition. So value planning workshop. It's ended up with a couple other alternatives that had not been considered before. It's ended up with roundabouts and signalized intersections. It's tested different roundabout operation than have been implemented in the region. So it's a change for the authority. No decision has been made, but this is just one of the roundabout solutions. So it's to provide a grade separation for the main movements from the school to the commercial areas. There's commercial properties in 3 different quadrants of the intersection, and there's huge volumes of kids that all leave the school to go between those commercial areas. And there's concerns for both, pedestrian safety, vehicle operation and safety. And the day that we did our value planning workshop and did a field trip, there was a person with vision loss that had a near miss of being hit at the signalized intersection. So the signalized intersections have many issues for safety, as well as the roundabouts. So ideas from the workshop included signalized crossings in the roundabouts, grade separations for the roundabouts, as well as looking at different control that the region uses now for signalizing. So this is one that we had inclusion for different stakeholders right from the very beginning for the workshop stages to try to build consensus for something that can be implemented. So this is just shows utilities or scores for one criteria. So this is delays to pedestrians and cyclists. So there's been modeling done, a large number of alternatives, and each of the alternatives get a utility score between 0 and 1. Best performers get a 1. Lower performers get a 0. What's really cool about this exercise is dealing with people with vision loss or legally blind to go through these intersections. We have two persons with vision loss that are participating in the evaluation process, so they'll be doing the weighting exercise. The interesting thing is both of them don't have exactly the same perspectives. We have one of the participants with vision loss is a senior, and one is a younger female, and they have different concerns about safety and personal security. So it's inclusion of a broader perspective. And it's an area that we've got data now. There's like 150 people in this section of the city with vision loss that are candidates that go through this intersection. So anyway, so we have included them as part of the definition of performance for accommodating accessibility. So those utility scores go between 0 and 1, and it's based on their participation in defining the performance. The weighing exercise hasn't been completed, but they will be part of the decision-making process. So anyways, conclusions. I mean, my philosophy is if you have engagement as part of the project, you usually get better acceptance of delivery of things being implemented. You can use engagement to include participants that may not traditionally be part of the decision-making process. It makes it easier to implement. And inclusion, part of the consultation in Ontario, it's something that we are mandated to do as part of a municipal undertaking. And the tools that we have as facilitators, value analysis, value methodologies, it fits well with public consultation. And I've got it in. It's a good technique to gain creativity.